Suddenly, she woke up. She couldn't comprehend what the hell she was seeing. She was being given multiple injections, even some things were rubbed on her skin. She felt woozy, but was completely aware of her surroundings. She was entering a rare state in which some patients go through while undergoing surgery. They are unable to see as they are being worked on. They can feel the pain. Their brain is active, but they cannot respond. However, she was able to. Her heart rate on the monitor started to speed up, and the doctors took notice of this. They looked at her, seeing her opened eyes. One of the doctors was yelling at another. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but she suddenly felt a rush of adrenaline. She slowly started to slip through her bonds, shaking violently. One of the doctors was going to hold her down, but was suddenly hesitant of doing so, and all three of the doctors backed away. She sat on the edge of the bed now and ripped off the mask and tube from her arm. She got up and started to stumble towards them. Her breath hitched and her vision was blurry. She could make out herself giving off a couple insane chuckles, but suddenly she felt a searing pain in her chest. She gripped where her heart would supposedly be and dropped to her knees. She coughed blood and fell to the floor completely, blacking out. She woke up slowly and groggily after that. She was back in the bed. The doctor was sitting beside the bed.
Something went horribly wrong.
She didn't know why, but she felt a tremendous amount of hatred towards the doctor. He took notice of it and looked away.
You weren't supposed to wake up while we were giving you the doses for your mental state. We aren't sure how it affected you, but we have a feeling we're going to find out.
He paused for a second before taking out a small mirror, not looking at her.
It happened to have an effect on your appearance as well.
She looked at herself in the mirror, and her eyes widened. Her eyes, they were completely green. She noticed she still had the stitches in her mouth as well, but for some reason, she couldn't help but feel happy. Her heart rate started to increase again. She gave out a low chuckle. The doctor looked in shock, seeing she was suddenly already standing over him.
Doctor?
She said, still chuckling. He trembled slightly, pressing a button from under the monitor.
Yes?
Your time is up. A loud scream was heard through the halls of the apparent hospital. 2 security guards rushed into the room, kicking open the door. Blood was the first thing they saw. Blood on the walls, on the bed, on the floor, hell, even on the ceiling. Natalie had taken the doctor and strapped him down on the bed. His spine was completely snapped as the bed was bent almost into a sandwich, likely from the adjustments someone could make to it.
God.
Blood poured from his eyes, nose, mouth, and just about every orifice of his body. And there in the corner was the murderer, happily drawing her gruesome pictures on the wall in blood, followed by the phrase, "Your time is up." She slowly turned to look at them, a wide, crazy grin spread across her face.
Hello, friends. Would you like to play?
The guards quickly pulled out guns when suddenly she charged at one of them, being able to dodge his bullets. She grabbed a large knife from a sheath onto his pocket and slashed it right across his waistline. Blood and organs flooded out, and he collapsed to the ground. She inhaled deeply, loving the damp stench of death. The others shook with fear and dropped his gun. She slowly walked up to him and placed the tip of the knife at his chest. Your time is up. She slowly slid the knife down his chest, all the way to the end of his gut. His organs spilled out onto the floor as well, and collapsed, dead. Natalie's mother was silently sleeping in her room next to her husband. She awoke to the sound of knocking on her door. She groggily got up and walked out of the bedroom to the front door. It was completely pouring outside, and thunder boomed in the distance. She walked up to the door and paused when she was about to grab the knob. There was a faint sound of insane laughter. The rain and thunder seemed to become quiet suddenly. She pressed her ear against the door and listened closely.
"Hello, Mother."
Natalie burst through the door, wielding 2 knives in hand. Her mother stumbled back, hitting her head against the coat rack. One of the hooks broke into her skull, and she bled violently from the back of the head onto the floor. She fell to the ground paralyzed, but still conscious. Natalie towered over her, but slowly knelt down to meet the level of her eyes, and showed her 2 knives covered in thick, red blood.
"I was suffering, Mother."
She ran the tip of the knife across her cheek, cutting it slightly. Natalie tilted her head.
"But you did nothing."
All her mother could do was shake and gasp constantly like a fish on land. Natalie grabbed her mother and gently set her down so her back was laid flat on the ground. She proceeded to sit on top of her and started to make a V cut on her chest. Her mother only gasped and shook, but her breath started to seem choked and gurgle. Natalie knew she didn't have much time left. She proceeded to forcibly open her chest cavity with a loud crack and reached in and grabbed her mother's heart as it slowly beat in her hand. Its pulses were growing dimmer and dimmer, and suddenly she ripped it out, blood spraying all over her face. She stared at her mother directly in the face as she slowly died.
"Sweet dreams,"
she said to her mother's corpse.
"Your time was up."
She put the heart into her mother's mouth, patting her cheek softly, and stood up. She wasn't done yet. Natalie's father, David, had stirred awake and realized that his wife had not returned yet. His eyes started to adjust to the darkness when he suddenly realized Natalie, standing on his bedside, smirking crazily with her green eyes glowing in the darkness. Blood was all over her, and the scent was unbearable. She put on a fake sad face.
"Oh dear, Mother's gone. I wonder who will get the money."
She suddenly grabbed her father's forehead.
"That's all you ever cared about anyway."
Her father, however, was a fighter, and he sprung up and grabbed her by the neck and threw her to the ground. He started to stomp on her chest until she coughed blood, and he stared down at her.
Doesn't it feel good, Daddy?"
She coughed up more blood.
"After all, you never seemed to mind doing it all those years ago, didn't you?"
He narrowed his eyes.
"You aren't my daughter!"
A wider smirk spread across her face, and she looked at him with her glowing eyes as blood dripped down her mouth.
"You're right. I'm not."
She suddenly tripped him, causing him to fall hard on the floor. She got up, knives in hand.
"They say the bigger they are, the harder they fall."
While he was winded, she grabbed a pillow and stuffed it in his face and started to stomp on his face, harder and harder, hearing loud cracking noises after a while. When she pulled the pillow away, his face was gruesomely mutilated, and he was making muffled noises and crying in pain.
"What's the matter, Daddy? Pain too much for you?"
She stabbed both knives into his stomach, leaving them there for now as she ripped off one of the large heavy wooden poles from the bed. She set it down on his legs and took out her knives.
"Gonna need these."
She chuckled and sat on the pole laid on his legs. Suddenly she started to walk back while sitting down. The weight from her body on the pole slowly started to squeeze his innards up through his body. He started to gag, and blood poured from his mouth. His breath was silenced, and she hit a bit of a snag.
Come on,"
she snarled as she forced herself to walk back with more weight. Suddenly, his organs burst out of his mouth. The nasty gore piled onto the floor on the sides of his face. She nodded to his carcass, and started to walk out.
Your time was up, Daddy.
Finally, this would be her favorite part. She quietly snuck down to her brother's room, silently opening the door. Blood dripped from her knife, making a low tapping sound as the droplets hit the hard wood. Her brother wasn't in bed. It was apparent that he must be hiding somewhere. She grinned.
Oh dear brother, come now.
She started to walk inside.
All I want to do is have a little fun.
As she stepped in more, she listened closely for any sounds, any breathing, any moving. She even sniffed the air for his putrid scent, and the closer she listened, she finally noticed something. A faint, breathing noise. Whack! She fell to the ground, trembling. Her brother was behind her with a now bloodied baseball bat. He was glaring down with anger, panting in rage. She tried to slowly get up, but he hit her again and again and again.
Mother always did like you best, you bitch!
He hit her hard one last time before taking a breather. She was bleeding heavily, her eyes drooped and glowing faintly in the darkness. She felt weak and looked closer up at the ceiling. She recalled the days she had spent in here, being tortured, having to go through it for 4 years. Looking at that same damned ceiling, it sent a sudden rush of energy into her body, and she started to stand, laughing insanely. Her brother went to hit her again, but used both of her knives to block it.
You're going to hell, brother.
With a large push, she sent her brother flying on the bed. He hit his head against the wall and growled angrily, about to lunge at her, when she stabbed the 2 knives into his arms, keeping them pinned on the wall. He screamed and struggled rapidly.
Let's see what we can use here.
She started walking around the room and smirked, seeing a simple butter knife on his bedside. She picked it up and walked over to him.
They say the eyes are the softest organs on the body.
She slowly licked the knife.
Soft as butter.
He looked in horror, trying to get away as she started to dig out his eyes with the knife. He shrieked loudly, and she quickly tied a cloth around his mouth.
Now, we can't have you waking the neighbors.
He wasn't able to see anything. The pain was unbearable. Blood leaked violently from his eye sockets. He would cry, but he was now incapable. She dug around for more items and picked up a pair of scissors.
I think you need to cut loose, brother.
She stabbed the scissors into his gut, and he cried out in a muffled scream of pain. She treated him like arts and crafts, cutting through his skin like paper. She lifted up his large intestine and smirked wickedly.
You know what I love? Macaroni art.
She started to cut the intestine into sections.
These might be a little too big to put on a plate, though.
She could hear her brother foaming blood from the mouth. However, he had to swallow the blood back because of the cloth around his mouth.
Doesn't that taste good?
She licked his blood off her fingers.
I sure know I like it.
He let out another muffled scream. She went down to his toes and started cracking them and ripping them off, one by one. After a while, his screams grew futile. His throat was raw and bloody by now. Next, she worked on his fingers, snapping them and ripping them off slowly. The gurgling became louder, and he started to squirm. He was choking on his own blood. She pulled the cloth down, and blood poured from his mouth.
There, brother,
she said, patting his head.
Eat this and feel better.
She stuffed one of his fingers in his mouth, making it jam into his throat. He choked and slowly died.
Your time was up.
The girl, known as Natalie, walking into her room dripping blood. Off to the corner she saw it. Her stuffed giraffe. She knelt down and stared at it. Then, without a word, she stood back up and walked to her bathroom. Staring at herself covered in blood, she heard a faint ticking noise. She looked down and saw a pocket watch. She stared at its hand slowly turning, listening to the ticking for what seemed like an eternity. She took out one of her now red knives as it heavily dripped blood onto the counter. She grabbed the pocket watch and disassembled the watch until only the small clock was left. "Time makes you live through the torture," she said, slowly bringing the knife up to her eye. "Slowly progressing through life, being controlled by society." She started to slowly dig it into her eye as the vision in her left eye grew blurry and red. "Until you find you no longer have a purpose." She felt her eye start to relent from its socket, blood pouring into the sink. "It's a vicious circle." She felt it dangle out of her socket, a sharp pain where it was connecting in her head. "Time does not speed up. It does not slow down. It is violent." She grabbed onto the cord of her eye and tore it right off, the eye falling into the sink. "It makes you live through the torture over and over again." She started to place the clock in her eye. Unable to fast forward away from it, there was a squishing sound and drips of blood until it seemed like the clock fit perfectly in her socket. "I am Clockwork." The young 16-year-old girl, used to be known as Natalie, walked away from her burning house. The flames engulfed everything, and inside, the giraffe slowly burned, along with the carcasses of her family. Some say she still lives on, carrying her insanity with her, leaving so many dead, saying she decided when their time should come to an end. The only way to detect her presence is if you're cuddled close in the covers at night, sleeping soundly. But in the darkness, she watches, she determines. You hear ticking, and you see a green flash of that putrid clock eye. If she is there, you know your time is up.